Mark, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I always enjoy coming to the UK, and especially to get a chance to meet my friend Mark, and he is my friend, but it's the first time we've seen each other face to face. One never knows how one is going to be introduced, so I always like to bring my own introductory slide along. I'm a cell biologist. I work on biological membrane structure and function. I publish in journals like Cell and the Journal of Cell Biology. As Mark was kind enough to mention, I also write textbooks. And one or another of these biology textbooks, they're intended for the secondary level. One or another of these are used in about half of all the high schools in the United States. And in fact, one of my own daughters had to suffer the indignity of using her old man's textbook for biology when she went to high school in the United States. She emerged from it, the process, I don't know if unscathed is the right word. Today, she is a history teacher. So she is the daughter of whom I do not speak. I've also written two books for general audiences on evolution. One is called Finding Darwin's God, a scientist's search for common ground between God and evolution. And more recently, a book called Only a Theory, Evolution and the Battle for America's Soul. Now, I know I'm in the UK, but I come, of course, from an American perspective. And evolution is an issue that divides Americans. A few years ago, Time magazine, one of our leading news weeklies, had a cover story called The Evolution Wars. They pointed out that in certain opinion polls, a majority of Americans will actually reject the theory of evolution. That issue pointed out that our president at the time, George W. Bush, had spoken out on the issue of evolution in the schools, not in a particularly helpful way. Although look very carefully. My co-author called me up about this, very excited. Look at whose textbook they superimposed President Bush's face on. That's actually one of our textbooks. And I was very excited about that because Joe Levine and I are always looking for new cover art for our textbooks. And in a couple years, when they buy new books in Texas, that might turn out to be a winner. We'll see how that goes. But to illustrate the magnitude of this, in the space of less than a year, I found myself in federal court testifying as an expert witness on the teaching of evolution in two American states, one Pennsylvania, the other one Georgia. I'm going to tell you about what happened in Pennsylvania. A year later, evolution was the issue in statewide elections in two other states where they elect the boards of education. And those two states were Kansas and Ohio. Now, in the US, education is a local function. And in many states, the state board of education is elected by district, almost like representatives or members of parliament. Here's what an election fought out over the issue of evolution sounds like. This is the front page of the largest newspaper in Ohio, about 10 days before that election. And you can see the subheading here is Evolution Debate at the Center of State School Board Race. And what they did is they highlighted the contest for one seat in the Akron, Ohio area between this woman, Deborah Owens Fink, the leader of the anti-evolution forces on the board, and her opponent, and you can't make this stuff up, her opponent right here with the very memorable name of Tom Sawyer. Here is what a talk show host, a radio host in Cleveland, told his listeners was at stake. He said, if you believe in God, creation, and true science, vote for Debbie. If you believe in evolution, abortion, and sin, vote for her opponent. And you might wonder with rhetoric like that, how did Mr. Sawyer ever stand a chance? But as it turns out, pro-evolution candidates swept the school board elections in Ohio that year, and they also won the Kansas state elections as well. And I tell my colleagues in the American scientific community, don't give up on democracy. If we in the scientific community get out and we make the case, I'm convinced American voters will pick science every time. But we still have that challenge. Many of you may know that we're in the early stages of a presidential race. Two of the leading candidates for the Republican nomination, Michelle Bachmann and Rick Perry, have come out openly opposing evolution and favoring the teaching of creationism in the schools. In one American state, Kentucky, a $27 million museum has opened dedicated to creation. And coming very soon, a Noah's Ark theme park that actually treats Noah's Ark as history. And it's worth noting that this year, 8 American states have had anti-evolution legislation introduced in their state legislatures. It hasn't passed in any of them. It has moved past one house of the legislature in 3 of those states, but it's probably not going to become law. Now, lest you think this is just a problem for the other side of the pond, I want to make the point that this is not just an American problem. Nature magazine a few years ago did an article about anti-evolution in Europe. The BBC conducted a poll very recently and discovered that a majority of Britons say that creationism ought to be taught in the schools here. These are 2 anti-evolution pamphlets from Germany. If you speak German, you know that the Evolutionslüge means the evolutionary lie. And in fact, there you see the same statistic with Britain. And putting it more recently, just in the last couple weeks, a number of British scientists have found it necessary to publish a letter arguing that creationism should not be taught in schools in the UK. Now, why do they find this necessary right now? I suppose I'd have to ask my friend Richard Dawkins and the other people who have signed this letter, but I think it's worth noting that not too far from here, in fact, about 2 weeks ago, there was a highly publicized conference on an anti-evolution idea called intelligent design. So this is an issue that has gotten to this side of the pond as well, and clearly affects science education for better or for worse. I think for worse. I want to tell you a story about a small town in Pennsylvania in which the local school board instructed the biology teachers to begin teaching intelligent design. Now, this is a small town. This is the entire biology teaching staff of Dover Area High School. There they are, all 3 people. And at the risk of losing their jobs, they defied their local board of education. They said, we're not going to teach it, it's not science, and we won't even read the intelligent design lesson that the school board had written. So what the school board did was to send the superintendent into classrooms to read that lesson to students. The biology teachers literally stood outside in the hallway and refused to take part. The next day, 11 parents went to federal court, and they swore out this lawsuit arguing that the Board of Education had violated their First Amendment rights as Americans. This turned out to be a highly publicized case. Volunteer lawyers piled up on both sides, and it moved towards trial. Now, in the American context, I find that in the UK, I often have to explain to my British friends why a lawsuit or a courtroom would be an appropriate place to fight this out. Here's the reason why. The First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States reads in part that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And over the years, that statement, Congress shall make no law, has been extended to include any government body. And a local school board is a government body. So the argument was that what the board was trying to do was to use a public institution, the schools, to support and advance a particular religious point of view. And what that meant is that if we went into court and could show that intelligent design was actually an attempt to promote religion by pretending it was science, it would indeed be prohibited from public schools by the United States Constitution. Now, the trial began in September of 2005. I had the honor, although I'm not really sure that honor is the right word, of being the lead witness for those 11 parents, for the plaintiffs in this lawsuit, and it was an experience unlike any other. We prepared for this case all summer, and what I wanted to do, along with the attorney who worked with me, was simple. I had 2 things in mind. One is I wanted to show intelligent design is not scientific. Its arguments against evolution are just plain wrong. And the second thing is all of us together, and we had a team on our side, wanted to demonstrate that intelligent design is a religious movement, not science. And the reason for that is one of my friends told me the First Amendment to the United States Constitution does not protect you against stupidity in the classroom, but it does protect you against religion in the classroom, and that was the idea. Now, for the advocates of intelligent design, we're very excited. They said, we have drawn, by the luck of the draw, that's how it works in the US, a conservative judge. His name is John Jones. He was appointed to the bench by President George W. Bush, had very good, authentic conservative credentials. And one blogger fantasized that they would get the Darwinists in court under oath and break them down under cross-examination and get them to admit that evolution was just a lie. And what you see here, because cameras are not allowed in federal court in the United States, is the NBC television courtroom sketch of a representative Darwinist, namely me, on the stand being cross-examined the first day of the trial by attorneys for the other side. And incidentally, my cross-examination from a skilled attorney on the other side went on for 9.5 hours. And one of my friends, when I got back to my university, asked me what it was like, and I said, it's no big deal. It was just like having my PhD oral exam over and over and over again. Well, what actually happened was that what really happened is the trial demonstrated the collapse of intelligent design as anything even remotely resembling a scientific theory. And I want to show you in part how that was done. Because I am a cell and molecular biologist, my job when I opened the trial with testifying for our side was to demonstrate that what I would call the icons of intelligent design were actually false. Now, what do I mean by this? Advocates of intelligent design like to look at complex things in the cell, the proteins that clot our blood, the bacterial flagellum, which is an intricate little molecular motor, and say they are too complex to have evolved. So my job at the trial was to deal with these and other things like the immune system and show why the intelligent design arguments were wrong. Now, I find it particularly interesting to be here at the University of Birmingham today simply because one of the world's experts on the bacterial flagellum is, in fact, Mark Pallen, who just introduced me and invited me to come here. So that's one of the reasons I jumped at the chance. Well, here's the claim, the essential anti-evolution claim of intelligent design, and that is that evolution cannot explain the origin of complex cellular machines. This is an E. coli bacterium. These things are flagella. This is a computer-generated image of this beautiful rotary-powered engine inside the flagella. Now, why couldn't evolution produce these things? Here's the argument. Supposedly because they are irreducibly complex. That means they couldn't have been produced by evolution, and the bacterial flagellum is an example of that. Now, the leading proponent of this idea, who also testified at the trial, is a biochemist from Lehigh University, very good university, by the way, in the United States, named Michael Behe. Here's what he's written. An irreducibly complex system like this cannot be produced by numerous successive slight modifications. That's actually paraphrasing Darwin, of a precursor system, because any precursor to an irreducibly complex system that is missing a part is, by definition, non-functional. This is a multi-part system, and Behe says you need all the parts before anything works. Now, he's tried to explain this in a very folksy way. He says an irreducibly complex system would be something like a mousetrap, and a mousetrap has 5 parts. It's got a base, a catch, a platform, a spring, and a hammer. It says you need all the pieces. You can't catch a few mice with a platform, add a spring, catch a few more, and so forth. All the components have to be in place before this will do what it's supposed to do. Therefore, it's irreducibly complex. In the context of the flagellum, the complete machine, whether it's a mousetrap or a flagellum, which has about 40 proteins in it, has a function. But the individual parts of this do not. This is the argument. And as Behe points out here, natural selection requires a function. Therefore, this system would have to arise spontaneously, which is most unlikely. So the argument is the reason evolution can't do this is because these parts have no function. Only a designer could plan ahead and put them together. Putting it another way in graphic form, the complex multi-part machine works. Natural selection can favor it. But the individual parts have no function, and therefore they cannot be shaped by natural selection. Now you might wonder, how do evolutionists answer that? Have they thought of that before? The answer is yeah. The answer actually begins with Darwin, even though he didn't know any biochemistry. And that is that the individual parts of these machines originate with entirely different functions. And as they are combined into larger and larger groupings, new functions emerge from combinations of components until finally you get the complete machine. Now, that's not evidence, that's just an argument. But to me, as an experimental biologist, here's the cool part. These two alternative explanations are testable. If the intelligent design folks are right, the individual parts of a complex machine, like the flagellum, should be useless on their own. But if evolution is correct, the individual parts should be functional. They should actually do other jobs. So all we have to do is to go into nature and see which of those turns out to be correct. So here's a diagram from a review article showing some of the proteins in a flagellum. And what I'm going to propose is an experiment in which we take away not one part, not two, but all but 10 of those parts. Now the cool thing about computers and PowerPoints is that experiments like this are very easy to do. So watch carefully as I take away all but 10 parts. There it is. And what are left behind are these 10 parts. The names of the proteins are actually shown here. They span the inner membrane of the bacterium. And if you remember the definition of irreducible complexity, what is left behind should be non-functional. But it turns out, if you'll pardon the double negative, it's not non-functional. In fact, it works. It makes up something called, in other bacteria that don't have the flagellum, the type 3 secretory system. And right out there in the audience, I can see you're all going, oh, of course, the type 3 secretory system. Why didn't I think of that? The type 3 secretory system is a molecular syringe. It's a grouping of 10 proteins that some of the nastiest bacteria in the planet use to inject poisons into our cells and kill them. Yersinia pestis, which is the organism that produces bubonic plague, has a type 3 secretory system. But here's the interesting part. These 10 proteins, which have nothing to do with the flagellum and the bacteria that possess them, are absolutely homologous to the 10 proteins in the base of the flagellum. Now, why is that argument significant? Here's why. The core essence of intelligent design and irreducible complexity is that any precursor to a complex system like this that's missing a part is by definition non-functional. This guy is missing 40 parts. Is it functional? Yes, it is. So the only thing you can say about this, and this is not a stray quotation, this is the core argument against evolution from intelligent design. The best thing you can say about that is that it is wrong. And that's the point that I tried to make in my testimony in the trial. Now, this is not the only example. In fact, the bacterial flagellum is loaded with parts that are strongly homologous to other systems. These are proteins in the type 3 secretory apparatus, but nearly every other protein in there is part of another complex system, which in other bacteria has a completely independent function. And again, no one has pointed this out more eloquently, I hope he doesn't think I'm embarrassing him, than Mark Pallen, who has been really a fountainhead in terms of providing real, powerful, legitimate microbiological arguments as to why this whole idea is wrong. So breaking it down, ladies and gentlemen, what we have is simple, and that is careful analysis of the components of the very example, the bacterial flagellum, used by intelligent design, matches evolutionary theory, not the intelligent design creationism model. And that turned out to be critical in terms of scientific testimony. But I mentioned the fact that for this to be a constitutional case in the United States, we had to demonstrate something, and that is intelligent design was more religion than science. I want to show you how we did that, because it's almost funny. This is a textbook on intelligent design, which the Dover School Board purchased and made available to the school children in Dover. When you look through this book, I want to assure you, it sounds very scientific. There's nothing in there about the book of Genesis or the gospel or anything like that. Look at this. This is the definition of intelligent design. Intelligent design means various forms of life began abruptly through an intelligent agency, distinctive features already intact, fish with fins and scales, birds, blah, 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 etc. Now, before the case started, one of our attorneys executed what's known as a discovery motion. And he went to the publishers of this book and asked them, has this book ever been published earlier edition, different name? Can you send me editorial correspondence, page proofs, and so forth? I wasn't aware of any of this stuff. But lo and behold, we discovered that this book had been published in an earlier version. It was called Biology and Origins. It read paragraph for paragraph, just like Pandas and People, with one subtle difference. And look at this paragraph. Creation means various forms of life began abruptly through an intelligent creator. With their distinct, it's the same paragraph. And all these guys did, I assume, is to fire up Microsoft Word and do a find and replace the word creator with the word designer. Now, in case you doubt that, Barbara Forrest, who was another one of the expert witnesses, she's from a university in Louisiana, looked at all the early editions of this book And she counted up how many times they mentioned the creator or creationist, about 100 times, how many times they mentioned intelligent design. In the early versions of the book, almost nothing. But then all of a sudden, watch this, in the middle of 1987, creation goes to 0 and design goes up like this. Well, what happened? Well, what happened, and this is significant, is that what they had done is to relabel the creator a designer and to pretend the book was not religious. And why did they do it in the middle of 1987? 1987 was a historic United States Supreme Court case, which becomes the law of the land, labeling creationism and creation science as inherently religious. So they were told, can't use this book because it's about the creator. So somebody, probably in a focus group, went brainstorming and came up with the notion, let's not call it creationism, let's call it intelligent design. And let's see if we can do the find and replace and pull the wool over the eyes of students and courts and parents. Now, the Dover trial, the trial that I've been talking about, was covered in this country too. There was a BBC program called, ominously, A War on Science. And I had the honor of appearing briefly in that program, along with Richard Dawkins and David Attenborough, the usual science suspects over here in the UK. And it was a very interesting program. And what happened in the United States is we have a science series too, similar to the BBC Horizon series. It's called NOVA. And I want to give you a taste of what this whole confrontation was like by showing you a clip introducing that NOVA series. It won't last long. Watch this.
On NOVA.
I believe there is an intelligent design. In the beginning, God created.
Saying that you don't believe in evolution is almost saying we don't believe that the Civil War ever took place in the United States.
An extraordinary court case ignites a small town.
There's like a civil war within the community, there's no question.
And puts science itself on trial.
Very important things were at stake. One is the future of science education in this country.
NOVA reveals the story behind the headlines.
Anywhere you turned, we were getting attacked.
Witnesses started dropping like flies.
And probes the question, is intelligent design a scientific alternative to evolution?
Properly the subject of a science class.
Or religion in disguise?
It's a violation of everything we mean and everything we understand by science.
Judgment Day, intelligent design on trial on NOVA.
Now I hope that narration was dramatic enough for you. The TV people call that the end of the world style. This program actually received the Peabody Award, which is sort of like an Oscar for broadcast journalism, and it told a remarkable story. But what I haven't told you so far is how the case actually came out. Just before Christmas in 2005, the judge announced his decision, which was that intelligent design simply was not science. And this was front page news in all the newspapers in the United States, from USA Today to the New York Times. It was reported that night on all of our television networks, and it set off rejoicing among the parents, because remember, it was 11 parents who had gone to court to say this stuff is religious. A First Amendment to our Constitution protects an agency of the state from doing this. We want it out of the schools. So what I would love to say, now that this trial is over, is that the other side had their day in court. In fact, they had 3.5 weeks in court to try to develop their case, and the case simply fell apart. But the reason I wrote my most recent book, Only a Theory, Evolution and the Battle for America's Soul, is for 3 reasons. One is, unfortunately, the battle isn't over. The second reason might surprise you. It's not actually about evolution. It's really the result of a continuing attack on scientific reason itself. That's really what's at stake here. And finally, I think it matters for the future of science in my country, and I think it matters for the future of science in this country and in Europe as well. And I do think that continuing battles over evolution reveals in Europe, and especially in the United States, a deep unease about modern science. And in the United States, we've gotten concerned that our students are often lagging behind people in other countries, other industrialized countries, in terms of science and math. And I believe this kind of anti-science agitation has a direct effect. And Nature, one of the world's leading scientific journals, feels the same way. They had an editorial not long ago called Science Scorns. The anti-science strain pervading the right wing in the US is the last thing this country, the U.S., needs in a time of economic challenge. So what is it about evolution that bothers people so much? What's the fundamental reason for opposing evolution and producing posters like this? This is an anti-evolution poster widely circulated in Kentucky and Tennessee. I got a kick out of that because I didn't realize that gorillas could use a Bowie knife. It was just extraordinary to see the gorilla with the knife there. And the real reason, in the eyes of many people, is simple, and that is to deny that there are any intermediates between humans and other animals, to basically preserve for us the idea of a separate origin. This is a billboard that's appeared in many places in the country, and if you want to look up some really good anti-evolution propaganda, you can find it right there. Whoisyourcreator.com. Now, I find this as a biologist interesting, simply because over the last several years, and you'll hear more about this later today, we found an abundance of pre-human fossil evidence. A few years ago, this skull was reported in the journal Nature. It's called Kenyanthropus platyops. It was compared to a very famous skull that was discovered several decades earlier, usually classified as Homo habilis. And as usual, the journal Nature published a little interpretive report trying to show where platyops, right here, this little red bar, fit alongside all the other pre-human species that were known at that time. Now, there's more now. But I remember when I opened this issue of the Scientific Journal and looked at it, this whole chart showing all of these pre-human species looked very familiar to me, but I couldn't for the life of me understand why it looked familiar. After all, it was a brand new paper. It had never been published before. How could it look familiar? And it took me day after day after day of racking my brain to figure it out. When he published The Origin of Species, Charles Darwin put only one figure in the book, and this is part of it. And what he did was basically to sketch out what an evolutionary family tree would look like if you had all the intermediate forms. Darwin's sort of back-of-the-envelope sketch is now a dead ringer for what we know about the human evolutionary tree in terms of showing repeated branching, the extinctions of some branches and the persistence of others. In short, the old guy got it right, and he got it right the first time, and even his theoretical sketch now has an uncanny relationship to what we know about the ancestry of our own species. And again, you can't escape this stuff because there's so much of it in the news, and now that paleontologists know the right places to look, the right strata to dig to, we find more and more and more, and that human family record becomes more and more complete. Now, Nick Matzke, who was one of the people who worked with the Dover trial and has since subsequently authored some papers here with Mark Pallen, did something interesting a couple of years ago. He found a very dull, dry, systematic paper. This is the paper, and it really is dry. It's got like 16 pages of nothing but tables like this. And what the authors had done was to take the published values for the cranial capacity, the brain size, of every single hominid fossil that had ever been described. Now, this is a boring paper, not a big deal, but you know what Nick did? He took the data and he plotted it out on an Excel spreadsheet. And what you see here is a graph of cranial capacity over millions of years before present. Modern humans are up here, about 1,400 cc's. As we go backwards in time, and this is color-coded by species, we gradually get down to the 400 cc, characteristic of our Australopithecine ancestors. I'm often asked by lay people, isn't there still a missing link? Isn't there a big gap between human beings and our pre-human ancestors? Take a look at those sizes. The answer is we don't see a gap. What we see is a progression that shows very clearly how this critical organ, the brain, increased in size quite rapidly over the last several million years. And it's powerful. Every single dot up there is an individual specimen whose brain size has been measured. But I'm not really a fossil guy. I'm much more of an RNA, DNA guy. And for me, this is more persuasive. Right about the time of that trial, Nature published the DNA sequence of the chimpanzee genome. And a sentence in the lead article sort of gives it all away. More than a century ago, Darwin and Huxley proposed that humans shared recent common ancestors with the African great apes. Modern molecular studies have spectacularly confirmed this prediction. Indeed, they had. But I had to explain this stuff in court. And of course, the judge is a lawyer, an attorney by profession. So as one of my friends put this, This is complicated molecular data, and we got to put it in terms that are so simple that even an attorney can understand them. So here's what we actually did in court, and this is a slide that I showed for the judge's benefit. We have a lot of evidence that we share recent common ancestors with the other great apes, gorillas, orangs, chimpanzees, and so forth. But interestingly, and this is significant, we humans have 46 chromosomes. All the other great apes, without exception, have 48. Now, if you studied biology, you know very well, those 46 come in two sets. Each of you got 23 from mom and 23 from dad. A baby chimp gets 24 from mom and 24 from dad. So if we share a common ancestor with these guys, why are we missing a pair of chromosomes? Is it possible, for example, that in the human evolutionary tree, a pair of chromosomes, they just got trashed, they just got wasted, and we're missing them today? The answer to that is no. Any geneticist will explain to you that the loss of both members of what's called a homologous pair of chromosomes would be fatal. You couldn't even get through embryonic development. So there's only one possibility that's consistent with evolutionary common ancestry, and that is the two chromosomes that are still separate in the other primates got accidentally fused together, stuck together to form a single chromosome in us, in you and me. Now, if that happened, it would have dropped us from 24 pairs down to 23, so there's your answer. But this is why evolution is science and not conjecture. If that's true, we can test it. Somewhere in the human genome, there must be a recently fused chromosome, if evolution is true. But how would we find it? Now, it turns out it's easier than you might think. What I've sketched up here are two chromosomes. Near the tip of each chromosome is a sequence with highly repetitive DNA that's really, really characteristic. It's called a telomere sequence, and I colored it in blue. Near the center of every chromosome, equally special region known as the centromere. Here's what would happen if you and I carried a chromosome formed by the fusion of two of these chromosomes. Do you know what it would have today? It would have that blue telomere DNA in the middle where it doesn't belong. And you know what else it would have? It would have two centromeres. It ought to be really easy to pick out. So let's look at our own genome. Do we have a chromosome with telomere DNA in the center and two centromeres? We sure do. In fact, that's human chromosome number 2. Our second chromosome has every characteristic I have just described. It's got telomere DNA in the middle where it doesn't belong, and it has two centromere regions, and they correspond in terms of DNA sequence to the centromeres for chromosome 13 and 12 in our primate relatives. Is there any way to explain these facts? And remember, DNA sequences are facts. They aren't theories, they aren't hypotheses. Can you explain these facts on the basis of the idea that our species was uniquely created or intelligently designed? The answer is no, you can't. Evolution is literally the only way to explain them, and that really is the point. But remember what makes so many people uneasy about evolution. In the United States, I'm told all the time that evolution says that God doesn't exist. And I'm always quick to say you're confusing a scientific question with a theological one, but nonetheless, they have good reason to point to certain individuals and activities on these islands and say, but over there they think so. This is Richard Dawkins, whom I do actually consider a very good friend, and I think, and everyone thinks, I think, who knows him, the greatest writer, the greatest explanatory writer on evolutionary theory alive. You should read Dawkins' books. He helped to pioneer a campaign, sort of an atheist bus poster campaign that showed up in London and a few other cities in the UK. The BBC magazine, not very long ago, did a profile of Dawkins coinciding with the 200th anniversary of Charles Darwin's birthday. It was an interesting, it was a very interesting piece. And then they decided to have a little counterpoint in the BBC magazine. Is the theory of evolution compatible with divine creation? And curiously, they went to our side of the pond over the US to get two people to go back and forth. And in terms of no, they went to a philosopher at Tufts University in the Boston area named Daniel Dennett. He says, no, evolution is not compatible with the idea of God. And then they came to me, and I wrote a little piece in the BBC magazine for why evolution was compatible with the idea of God. Now, what I want to do today in closing is not to convert anybody to anything, but I want to make a point. And that point is that it is not only possible, but there is precedent for religious people to say, yes, A person who is religious should accept everything in science, and that includes evolution. And you can still remain religious in the view of many, many people. And I just want to give you a couple of quick examples to make this point. This is a photograph of Theodosius Dobzhansky. If you get into the study of evolution at a high level, you will discover that Dobzhansky is regarded as the greatest evolutionary geneticist of the 20th century. It was just extraordinary. He made major contributions to what's known as the synthetics theory of evolution. He wrote a famous article, which is better known for its title than anything else. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And that's absolutely positively true. Without evolution to tie it together, biology is just sort of stamp collecting. It's a bunch of isolated facts. Evolution makes sense out of biology. But in the same article, Dobzhansky wrote something interesting. He said the diversity of life is reasonable and understandable if the Creator made the living world not by caprice, I would say not by intelligent design, but by evolution propelled by natural selection. Then he said, it's wrong to have creation and evolution as mutually exclusive. I, Dobzhansky, am a creationist and an evolutionist. Now, how could he say that? He said, because, in his view, evolution is God's or nature's method of creation. Creation is not something that happened in 4004 BC. It is a process that started 10 billion years ago and is still underway today. That's a scientist talking. How about a religious leader, in case you doubt his faith? Well, a number of religious leaders have spoken out on evolution. Not too many years ago, Pope Benedict called this notion of a clash an absurdity. And here's what he said as reported by Italian journalists. The contrast between creation and evolution is an absurdity because there are many scientific tests in favor of evolution, which appears as a reality that we must see and enriches our understanding of life and being. Well, that's sort of complicated wording. I would characterize that as Pope speak in one sense or another. So if you're confused by that, I advise that you do what I always do when I'm confused by a complex statement by a public official, and that is pick up the nearest Rupert Murdoch paper, and they will sort it out for you. In my case, it's the New York Post, and here's how that was summarized. Evolution and God do mix, Pope. End of story. Now, to sort of illustrate what I would call, in many years, the relationship between Western monotheism and religion, and science, I should say, I want to go back to St. Augustine. St. Augustine was one of the most prolific and influential of the early Christian writers. He did the bulk of his writing at the beginning of the 5th century. And among other things, Augustine wrote, the universe was brought into being. This is really an insightful statement for someone 1,500 years ago. Brought into being in a less than fully formed state, but was gifted to transform itself from unformed matter into a truly marvelous array of structures and life forms. That's remarkably forward-looking, and I have a feeling if Augustine was alive today, he'd be an evolutionist. Now, very often when I speak to purely scientific audiences, they like me, right up to the point where I start quoting Dobzhansky about religion and that sort of stuff. And I was actually asked at a scientific meeting, said, well, you know, it's nice that you like Augustine, but what kind of science would we get if we did science according to a 5th century mystic like St. Augustine? And knowing this person's field, I had a ready answer for him. And the answer came in terms of a particular person. The person whose photograph you see here was very religious. He entered a religious order founded according to the precepts of St. Augustine. It was an Augustinian order. He was well regarded within the monastery. And in this monastery, he was eventually elected its abbot. And he retired many years later as the abbot of the Augustinian monastery of St. Thomas in Brünn in what is now the Czech Republic. At one point in his life, this very religious guy got interested in a question that today you and I would regard as a scientific question. How do plants pass their characteristics along from one generation to another? So how did this religious guy answer the question? Did he pray? Of course he prayed. He prayed every day. Did he read scripture? He had to, every day for what's called the Roman office. But when he had to answer a scientific question, you know what he did? He went into the garden and he did experiments. This very religious person interested in science was Gregor Mendel, the founder of the modern science of genetics. What kind of science do you get when you do science according to Augustinian principles? you get darn good science, you get genetics. And I think that's as profound a statement as anybody can make about the compatibility of science and religion. Charles Darwin wasn't religious, especially towards the end of his life. In a letter I'm about to show you, he describes himself most fairly as an agnostic, although he denies that he has ever been an atheist. But he was asked by a correspondent named John Fordyce, isn't it ridiculous that someone can support evolution and call themselves a Christian? Darwin gave Fordyce a pretty sharp reply. He said, Mr. Fordyce, it seems to me absurd to doubt that a man may be an ardent theist and also an evolutionist. And this is the text of that letter. And that's the point that I want to make, and it's a point that I've made in the United States to try to defuse religious concerns about the teaching of good, solid science in our schools. Now, I'm very happy to see my colleagues like Richard Dawkins and David Attenborough making a point similar to that about schools in the UK, that not creationism but evolution has to be taught. If you're interested in what these scientists have recently said, there's a website right here in the UK called evolutionnotcreationism.org.uk, and I would urge you to go there and have a look at it. Very often I'm asked whether or not I find the whole idea of evolution to be demeaning or degrading. And I try to answer. And I might answer by quoting this letter, because it's a very good letter or something along those lines. But I found that the most adequate answer to that question of how to regard evolution was written a long time ago. It was written, in fact, 152 years ago by the very same person who kept this page in his notebook. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen this before, but it's rare in the history of science. You can point to one page in somebody's notebook and say, right there is one of the great ideas of all time, and no one had ever had it before. This guy wrote, I think, and then he made a sketch of a kind that no one had ever made before, explained it down here, came back a couple weeks later, and added more explanatory notes. At the end of a great book that you've all heard of, here's what this gentleman wrote. He said he didn't find evolution degrading or demeaning. He said, on the contrary, I think there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most wonderful and most beautiful, have been and are being evolved. That's the concluding sentence of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. And ladies and gentlemen, I think those are words to live by. Thanks a lot.